His career in the air was significantly less important than what he accomplished on the ground. His battle record is short, consisting of a single, hastily organized mission during what has come to be known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. He didn't return from that mission for 8.5 years. He spent that time fighting his own private war. Along with his fellow POWs, he denied the North Vietnamese the propaganda victory of turning American prisoners against the war effort.
Everett was a source of inspiration to all of us.
When released from captivity, he emerged remarkably whole into a country appallingly fragmented. Once an inspiration only to a few, he became an inspiration to his entire nation. He is Everett Alvarez, and he is a legend of air power. Everett Alvarez was born December 23, 1937, in Salinas, California. Salinas was a tough town, a center of what came to be known as agribusiness, where the divisions between the haves and have-nots were sharp and seemingly insurmountable.
His father was a stern taskmaster. Everett Alvarez was not a tough kid. In fact, it was something his father worried about. His father bought him boxing gloves, hoping to make him into a man.
What the senior Alvarez mistook for weakness was in fact a deeply serious nature. Everett was determined to escape Salinas and to make an impact on the larger world outside. He became the first member of his family to attend college, and in 1960 received a degree in electrical engineering from Santa Clara University. Flying east for a job interview, he found himself more fascinated by the plane than by the job, and enlisted in the Navy's Aviation Officer Candidate Program.
One of the reasons he joined the Navy was he thought it would give him social grace. He felt because of his ethnic and poor background that he didn't have the social graces necessary to succeed in America.
He took his flight training in Pensacola, Florida, and Kingsville, Texas, and in November 1961, he got his wings. His first assignment was to attack Squadron 144, first at Naval Air Station Lemoore, and subsequently aboard the USS Constellation. It was, according to Alvarez, a great time to be a pilot.
It was still a lot of partying. It was a real sort of a real gay, real, hell-bent for leather. The World War II flying, when you come in and everybody's toasting and partying, and then you go out and fly your plane with the scarves and all that. You think of it in those terms.
Alvarez was single when he left for his first tour of the West Pacific. For 6 months, he lived the life of a naval aviator at sea, immersed in the honorable rituals of officers and gentlemen. It was an uneventful tour, played out against the background noise of the Cold War. And Alvarez returned to the United States for shore leave, a happy man.
I was married just before I left on my second cruise. I was married in December of 1963, actually 6 months before we left the States.
He was young, in love, and on his way to sea for a second 6-month tour. By the time the Constellation arrived on station in the South China Sea in 1964, the United States was already involved in a game of superpower saber-rattling over the regime in North Vietnam. The communists there had succeeded in driving the French colonialists out of the country and were openly threatening the capitalist South. The United States, convinced that the fall of South Vietnam would precipitate a communist takeover of all of Southeast Asia, had already placed advisors on the ground and was making a strong show of naval force offshore. On August 2nd, in the Gulf of Tonkin, 3 North Vietnamese PT boats came close enough to an American destroyer that the destroyer fired at them. The nearby aircraft carrier USS Ticonderoga launched 4 fighters to aid the destroyer, and after a 20-minute skirmish, one of the PT boats had sunk. 3 days later, the 2 American destroyers reported they were under attack by other PT boats. While historians debate whether this attack ever really occurred, President Lyndon Johnson took the report seriously enough to order retaliatory strikes on North Vietnam. Aboard the Constellation, Attack Squadron 144, including Everett Alvarez, set out to execute a hastily called attack on the harbor at Hong Gai. Alvarez climbed into his Crusader and, along with 15 other aircraft, launched into one of the first battles of the Vietnam War. The harbor was obscured by a layer of smog and a layer of what turned out to be the smoke of anti-aircraft fire. Alvarez went in low, but couldn't get a fix on his target.
I had made a second pass, which is I shouldn't have. And in exiting, we were inside the harbor. I had to cross over a piece of land, and I was joining up on my lead. I was the wing, and I was very low, and I was going very fast, and I was just skimming the trees tops as we're heading out, and I got hit.
He saw a flash, smoke, and managed only a short radio transmission before he punched out.
I remember before we launched that day, it was a Wednesday, and we had gone through our briefings, what have you. Went down to get a bite to eat in the wardroom, and I remember noticing that Wednesday is roast beef night aboard ship, and this is strange, but several hours later, when I was shot down and floating in the water before they captured me, I remember thinking, son of a gun, I'm on a miss roast beef night.
It is safe to say that Alvarez had not yet come to grips with the reality of his situation. America was barely involved in the war in Vietnam when Everett Alvarez was shot down. In fact, 2 days after he was shot down, the United States Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The resolution authorized President Lyndon Johnson to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed force, to protect American and Allied forces in Southeast Asia. Alvarez, of course, knew nothing of political developments in the wake of his shoot-down. He had landed in the water and found himself quickly trapped by North Vietnamese.
I was surrounded by fishing boats. Turns out they were fishing. Everybody in that country belongs to a militia of some sort. And they had all these rifles, and they surrounded me. It didn't take very long for them to... I was trying to hide and underwater and swim, but they outnumbered me by hundreds. And they found me, and they captured me, took me in.
Because he was the first American POW taken by the North Vietnamese, there was no standard operating procedure for processing POWs. In fact, because the United States and North Vietnam were not legally at war, the North Vietnamese treated him not as a POW, but as a criminal. They took Alvarez to the naval base that had just been one of the targets of the American air raid. They stripped him and bound him, wrapped his face with a blindfold, and locked him up.
That's when I first began to realize, I'm hurt. I mean, I hurt. It was the adrenaline I think was starting to wear off.
They interrogated him almost constantly. They wanted to know about his unit, its assignment, and home base. They wanted to know about his ship and its capabilities, his family, his politics. Alvarez refused to answer, repeating only his name, rank, and serial number as required by military law and custom. They blindfolded him and moved him to an isolated farmhouse. He was visited by high-ranking officers, and on one of those visits, Alvarez got a glimpse of the bleak psychological warfare that all American POWs were going to be subject to.
One night, this one fellow who had been at the interrogations, as I called him, he had a beak of a nose, a little nose. It reminded me of an owl, so later on I called him the owl in describing him. He came in one night, got me up. He says, "You have refused to answer our questions. You refuse to answer our questions." I said, "Well, I can't." He says, look, and he pulled out of his packet. He had all these Time and Newsweek and magazines from my hometown. He says, "We know all about this. We know all about this. This." And they put me into a Jeep. And that's when they drove me to Hanoi, and I wound up in the Hanoi Hilton.
Alvarez, who was thousands of miles from home and totally isolated, looked at pictures of his new wife back home crying. He read accounts of his family mourning him almost as if he were dead. In that moment, much of what the war in Vietnam and the POW experience would come to mean became clear.
They were very much interested in breaking the spirits of the POWs. They wanted to, in essence, make these people subservient, make them sign confessions, turn them into complete broken men, similar to the Manchurian Candidate, and then release them early and show the American public how they destroyed America's finest warriors.
When it became apparent to the North Vietnamese that Alvarez wasn't going to budge, let alone break, they shipped him off to the Hoa Lo prison, an abandoned, almost medieval French prison that came to be known as the Hanoi Hilton.
Single cells, all of them, little, about 3.5 by 8 foot long, all concrete, tin roof, a big old fence around it with on 2 sides, and the cells were on 2 sides, and the fence was barbed wire and glass.
There, the interrogations continued, with the North Vietnamese trying different approaches to get Alvarez to crack. But they had almost no experience with prisoner interrogations, and their lack of even basic knowledge of the American military meant they would believe almost anything Alvarez told them.
They wrote everything down when I was talking. And I thought, you know, as long as I talk and don't tell them anything important, maybe this will be okay. It seemed to make sense, because yeah, you had your code of conduct, but at this point you could stick to the code of conduct, but you also had to look at this situation, and I would talk to them, and then all of a sudden the food improved.
Alvarez tried to toe a very hard line. He would not give them information that had military or propaganda value, but he would tell them things he thought they already knew, or information that seemed to mean something but did not.
They wanted to know what my job aboard the ship was. Well, you know, I had not been on the ship very long, and I was a very junior officer. So my first job was to take care of the popcorn machine in our ready room. Describe popcorn. What is that? See, I spent a whole day talking about popcorn and the popcorn machine and how you serve it and all this, and they would write everything down. Well, this went on for days.
The North Vietnamese would only occasionally allow him to write a letter home, and when they allowed information from the outside world in, it was always to serve their own purposes. Pictures of his wife from a newspaper used to make him feel lonelier and more isolated. News of American military defeats or political struggles to make him feel as if he were persevering for nothing.
They would give us selected information. If it was bad news, like the assassination of Bobby Kennedy or Martin Luther King, they'd tell us. They would neglect to tell us minor events such as the moon landing. But if it was bad news, they would give us that.
Late in the year, after several months of isolation, the North Vietnamese took Alvarez to meet an American who had come to see him. They dressed him up, giving him wooden-soled shoes and new pants. Excited and also nervous, Alvarez went along to meet Robert Williams, an American expatriate visiting from his home in Havana. They met in a palatial residence, and on the table were fruit and cookies. And all during the meeting, Alvarez ate, making up for the starvation diet of the Hanoi Hilton.
So here's this fellow, and he says, would you like me to ask Ho Chi Minh? You know, he's a very good man, and if he would release you, take you home. I said, sure. He says, well, he says, you know, you got to do something to help yourself. I mean, you know, you got to write and apologize for what you've done, and that's the same thing again. I'm not going to do that.
Alvarez returned to the Hanoi Hilton, to the physical and psychological torture that was his daily life. He knew he could go home at any time, simply by signing a paper confessing America's crimes against the peace-loving people of North Vietnam. He knew that his family and friends would forgive him, even if his fellow officers would not. With no idea how long he would remain in captivity, Alvarez persevered. In 1964, when Everett Alvarez was shot down over North Vietnam and became the first American POW of the war, he could not have imagined how long the war would drag on. He persevered day by day, alone at first, and then as the old-timer in a group of POWs that seemed to grow almost daily.
He had a great memory for poetry, for passages of the Bible, and could remember those when he was in the POW environment. After all, they didn't have books, they didn't have movies. The only thing that they had to get them through the experience were the memories of other people.
We were typical Americans and cut across the spectrum. We had our pessimists and our optimists. We had the most religious to the agnostics, perhaps. We varied all over. But what we had in common, we were Americans. It says it all.
Communications are the most important thing, tapping on the walls and keeping in contact. It really is the key to it.
Jerry Denton at the time decided that we weren't talking fast enough, so he came up with what he called a cough hack spit code, where we could talk directly and clearing the throat for 1 and 2, and a cough hack spit for 3, 4, and 5 in that box diagram. And we used to sign off at night with something like, which is GBU or God bless you.
He scrawled Bible verses on the walls of the Heartbreak Hotel, the main processing area that all American POWs passed through. He entertained the other POWs with stories from literature and his life. As importantly, he listened to the other POWs and understood what they were going through, because he had gone through it as well.
Just the thought of going through that day after day and year after year, you know, your families, your kids grow up, you know, they grow up without dads. And it was just a terrible thing to have to think about.
As the war dragged on, the North Vietnamese, hungry for propaganda victories, increased the pressure on the POWs. Torture was commonplace, and several Americans were tortured to death.
The Vietnamese are not nice guys, the military, but they get direction from the top. They were communists through and through, and you could tell when they came out of their morning meetings, which they had every day, whether they were going to be mean or kind. Came out smiling, you knew we were going to have a good day. If they came out with mean looks on their faces, you could figure we're in for some bad treatment.
And I remember, you know, at night you hear the jingle of the keys, you say, oh God. That feeling inside you, knowing that, is he coming towards my door? And if they got closer, and then you hear the door the keys in the door lock being turned, and you realize, okay, it's somebody else. In a way you go, whew. On the other hand, you say, God bless that kid, that guy. You know, be with him. And then when it was your turn, you said, oh, Carmi. And there was no way to get out of it.
In 1966, the North Vietnamese paraded several dozen American POWs through the streets, hoping that public humiliation would cause the United States to pull out of the war.
My mother, when she saw the pictures of the march of the July 6, 1966, they marched, the 50 of us, through the streets of Hanoi, and she saw a picture of me. I mean, it made her. She went into the hospital. That's how hard it was on her.
The years passed, and the community of POWs grew. New prisoners came in and were accepted and indoctrinated into a strong, if struggling, community of POWs. They brought with them tales from the outside world, including the plots of movies that resonated with those long held captive. Now and then, a letter from home would get through, and the POWs held on to those contacts with the outside world as if their lives depended on them, which they did. For Alvarez, the critical link was his wife, Tangi. They had been married barely 6 months when he was shot down, and in the letters that changed hands, he could see that his captivity was hard on her.
One of the most heartbreaking moments in the POW experience for many prisoners, not just Everett Alvarez, was when the Vietnamese announced on Christmas that that Tangi had, in essence, abandoned him for another man.
Timed for maximum impact, the announcement rippled through the Hanoi Hilton. Alvarez, who had endured so much, who had been there so long, who had behaved so honorably, was crushed. If anything would break him, this was it. Surely, there was nothing left worth fighting for.
So you're thrown into the ropes, you're put into a situation, you're starved, you're beaten, you're getting beaten up, all and on, whatever it is. They're working on you to do it. And you have to make that determination yourself. How far do I go before I'm giving it? How much does it have to hurt before I do it?
In the end, he signed confessions of hostility toward North Vietnam.
When you're in that prison situation that I was in, when I'd start feeling sorry for myself, I would think of Everett Alvarez, who'd been there some 2.5 or 3 years before I was. So Everett was a source of inspiration to all of us.
The confessions were of absolutely no military significance, but the North Vietnamese carried them off as triumphantly as they had once carried off Alvarez's descriptions of American popcorn. And Alvarez returned to a community of POWs he had helped to build and strengthen. And far from condemning him, they nursed him back to health, reminded him that he had done his best, and that his best was all that could be reasonably expected.
Well, basically, I think that they had pretty much decided that anybody could be broken. You know, given enough time and the right resources, you can break anybody.
Everett Alvarez and the rest of the POWs were released in February 1973. Some of them had to be carried, some limped and squinted against the bright light. But they came home as they had survived, together, unbroken, ready to resume their lives.
Basically, we live from day to day, always with the state of mind that we made it through one day before we can do it again.
I think a lot of us always felt guilty about was that we were welcomed home as heroes and the other Vietnam veterans were not.
Alvarez had been in captivity for 8.5 years, nearly 3 times as long as the longest time served by an American prisoner in World War II or Korea. He had survived all of the longest war in American history, from its opening shots to its closing salute. He came back to a country radically changed, but he was remarkably optimistic, ready to resume the life he had barely known.